All right, for days now, it's been the one question on everyone's mind, right? When is this government shutdown gonna end? Well, it looks like we finally have an answer, or at least the beginning of one. Late Sunday night, Washington blinked. So we're gonna break down this last-minute deal, look at the hurdles that are still in the way, and figure out what this all actually means for everyone.
So let's just ask it straight up. Is the government shutdown finally over? Can we all breathe a collective sigh of relief? Well, the first big clue to that answer comes down to just one number. 60 to 40. That was the final tally. And while, it wasn't the final word, this was the moment. This was the vote that broke the stalemate. It was the first real, concrete sign that, hey, maybe this thing is actually coming to an end.
So, what's the short answer to that big question? Well, it's almost. And I know, that's probably a frustrating answer. But trust me, that one little word, almost, is packed with so much stuff. High-stakes deals, a ton of political drama, and, yeah, a few more hoops to jump through before we can say this is truly 100% over.
Okay, so to really get how we got to that 60-40 vote, you gotta understand the breakthrough that made it happen in the first place. This is really the story of the deal that pulled everything back from the brink.
Yeah, this didn't just happen out of nowhere. It all came down to a pretty critical group of Democratic centrists. They basically struck a deal directly with GOP leaders and the White House. And the agreement was, pretty straightforward. We'll vote to reopen the government right now, in exchange for a promise from you guys for a future vote on extending those enhanced affordable care subsidies. It's a classic Washington horse trade, really.
But remember that word I used before, almost? Well, this is where things start to get a little complicated. See, making that deal was a huge step, for sure, but it was just a first step. There's a whole legislative process that still has to play out, and believe me, it is full of potential traps. So, let's walk through what still needs to happen. First, the Senate has to give its final passage. Okay, step one. Then, that bill goes over to the House of Representatives, and they have to vote on it. And, this is key, only if they pass the exact same version does it finally go to the president's desk to be signed into law. And at every single one of those steps, something could go sideways.
And hey, you don't have to take my word for it. Just listen to the Senate Majority Leader, John Thune himself. He's using words like hopefully and talking about needing cooperation and consent. That's not the language of someone who thinks this is a slam dunk. He's basically telling everyone, hey, this whole thing is still really, really fragile.
So what does that fragility look like in the real world? Well, because of how the Senate works, literally any single senator can stand up, object, and drag this entire process out for days. For example, you've got Senator Rand Paul, who's looking for a vote on a totally unrelated amendment about hemp. And then you have 3 conservative senators who are worried about the overall budget process and are also threatening to pump the brakes. So yeah, roadblocks.
Okay, so while the politicians in DC are navigating all these hurdles, this shutdown is having very, very real consequences for people. So let's shift gears a bit and talk about the impact this is having outside of Washington, all across the country.
And this is really the core of the issue, isn't it? It's like you have these two different worlds. In one, you have the political maneuvering in Washington, and in the other, you have the rest of America feeling the very real, direct impacts on their day-to-day lives.
And these effects are just piling up day after day. We're talking about the Department of Agriculture having to stop full food stamp benefits. We're talking about thousands of federal workers being laid off. And with Thanksgiving right around the corner, one of the biggest travel times of the entire year is now seriously at risk. Just let that sink in for a second. The Transportation Secretary himself warned that air travel could be reduced to a trickle. A trickle. He's talking about the systems that keep our planes in the air, safely, being hit hard right before millions of us are trying to fly home for the holidays. Wow, that makes the stakes incredibly personal, doesn't it?
So with stakes that high, it's no surprise that this whole compromise has lawmakers asking themselves a pretty fundamental question. So let's get into the political fallout of all this.
After everything we've just talked about, was it worth it? Was shutting down the government the right play? What's really interesting here is a debate that's happening between 2 senators who, and get this, both actually voted for the deal to reopen everything.
So on one side, you've got Senator Angus King, who's an independent from Maine. And on the other, you have Senator Tim Kaine, a Democrat from Virginia. They both ended up voting the same way, but man, they have totally different views on the strategy that led them to that point.
So for Senator King, the answer to was it worth it is a pretty firm no. He's basically saying the shutdown was just a failed tactic.
He doesn't think it created any real leverage for his side, and he feels like the final deal pretty much proves he was right.
But then you have Senator Kaine, and he's got a completely different take. When he was asked the same question, his answer was, yeah. And his reason? It all comes down to the federal workers. He argued the whole fight was worth it to protect them from what are called RIFs. That stands for Reduction in Force Orders, which is just a bureaucratic way of saying mass layoffs.
And here's the specific thing he was talking about. A really important part of this compromise deal is that it reinstates the federal workers who are laid off, and, this is crucial, it blocks any more mass firings all the way through January. So for him, giving those workers that security, especially through the holidays, made the whole political battle worth it.
So here we are. The government is on the brink of reopening, which is good news. But let's be real. This is a temporary fix. It's a patch. The root problem, that whole broken budget process, is still just sitting there completely unresolved. And that leaves us with one pretty big lingering question. Are we just gonna have to go through this whole thing all over again in a few months?